Hey everybody, welcome to Martinis with Scott. We are on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Hope you're having a great week, and I certainly have. It's been a busy one here. Cheers, by the way. Thanks for joining me. I'm on the Fernie Distillers gin this evening. Well, it's not entirely true. I've been drinking wine as well, but for the show, so we have a martini-ish type drink. We've got the Fernie Distillers gin. What a great product. Episode 75 tonight. We're going to talk mostly about persuasion. And if you are trying to affect change in a business, if you're trying to make change in a troubled company, you need to persuade people to change. You need to persuade employees. You need to persuade stakeholders. You probably need to persuade yourself. And I love the art of persuasion. I love learning about it. It's been a passion of mine for the last couple of years, and we're going to talk about that a bit tonight. You know, people ask me, Scott, I know you love listening to podcasts. That's probably why you started the Martinis with Scott podcast, video podcast. And I say, yeah. And they say, well, what sort of podcast do you listen to? So here's my current regular podcasts. Every day, this is a daily show. I listen to Coffee with Scott Adams. Scott Adams is the creator of Dilbert Comics. If you're into the business newspapers and comics that have been published on business topics, Scott Adams is the king of that, and probably of comics generically one of the top guys. And he does a daily podcast which is entirely about persuasion. I'll talk more about him in a minute. I listen to that every day. I listen to Gary Vaynerchuk, but I think the podcast is called Gary V. I'm not going to say every day, and he puts out so much content, you just can't keep track of it all. But that's his whole shtick. His whole shtick is putting out content, adding value for free to create brand and to build an audience. And he puts on a great podcast. It's about marketing, it's about brand building, it's about confidence for entrepreneurs, and he's an interesting fellow to listen to. Super smart. Jordan Peterson in psychology puts out a podcast once a week. He's been off the circuit for quite some time with a personal illness, but he's got past content that, including lectures that come out, and I just find I learned so much from him in terms of the science of psychology and the science of biology and the science of, different disciplines within science and how the human brain works, how we've evolved, and if you could apply that to organizations, including business organizations. And so I just think there's so many parallels between his book, 12 Rules for Life, or whatever the hell that was. If you were to analyze those chapters, which I've done, and apply those, like, hey, I do that in business. Yeah, that's really important in a turnaround. It's interesting to me that an individual psychology at an individual level is applicable to organizations of any size, because at the end of the day, they're made up of people. A recent one for me, I was on this for a while, then I got off, and now I'm back on, is I listen, so this would be weekly, Hotep's Been Told You. What you said? Hotep's Been Told You. And this is a podcast by Uncle Hotep and Hotep Jesus, and I just think they're super smart. I think Hotep Jesus is very persuasive. You can learn a lot from him. And those two might be the funniest people on the face of the earth right now. I spend 2 hours in tears laughing. And recently, I just added, I don't know how long this podcast has been around, but Trey Gowdy, so former Congressman Trey Gowdy, who I believe is from South Carolina and has also just published a book. He has a weekly podcast, and it is largely about persuasion. The book, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is entirely about persuasion. And those are my primary don't miss podcasts. I also listen to Rogan if I happen to like the guest. I listen to Lewis Howes if I happen to like the guest. I have a bunch of other podcasts on my home screen, but I just never get the time to listen to them. So they're there in case I run out of things to listen to, but that rarely happens. All right, so 2 out of the list that I gave you are directly, one daily and one weekly, are directly educational in terms of the art of persuasion. And I've been fascinated by persuasion since Scott Adams' book, which was written after Trump's election. I believe it was called Win Bigly. Yeah, you heard me right. Bigly, grammatically incorrect, but that's part of the stickiness, part of the persuasion. And so let's call it, and say it's been 3 years since I've read that book and have become really a student of this. Now, it turns out I've been practicing persuasion my entire career. That's part of turning around a business, is part of affecting change within an organization. But I didn't know it, and I didn't know how to put words to it. I didn't know that there's tools that, maybe I was intuitively doing half of them, but I wasn't doing all of them. And there's a more refined way to go about what I was already doing. And so what is persuasion? It's the idea of moving somebody from their stated position in your direction. It's selling. It's getting them off the mark and trying to convince them to head in a direction that you want them to go in. And as I said, in an organization, if you want to affect change, people need to change. They need to do things differently. They need to be convinced that there's merit, and that's the right thing to do, and to embrace doing things differently, which is really hard because they have to break their habits. You have to break organizational habits and organizational systems. It takes a lot of persuasion to do that, to get people to do that. You have to convince stakeholders. If you're in trouble with your bank, I see it all the time, and the bank just decides, well, this company is, these are bad people and they never make money. Well, you need to get them off that, or you can never turn this business around. That requires persuasion. If you are the entrepreneur, it's easier for me to step into a troubled company because I didn't create the trouble, right? So I can come in and I can be positive. But if you're the entrepreneur, if you're the president, and the trouble happened under your watch, then you need to change and you need to persuade yourself. And that's pretty tricky as well. So let's talk about Scott Adams, who I've been, as I said, I've been watching him or listening to him almost daily for 3-4 years now. As I said, his claim to fame is the Dilbert cartoons. He's also a trained hypnotist, which you would initially think to be an odd thing to throw in there. But hypnotism is about, I didn't know this before, but it's about persuasion. It's about convincing people of alternative realities, different ways to view things, to do things that they otherwise never would want to do. I mean, it's a persuasion game. That's what it is, and he is trained in that, and he's studied persuasion his entire life. He's a he's got numerous books out. Many of them have been New York Times bestsellers. His books are generally about self-improvement and or persuasion, how to lead a better life, how to persuade. And since I've been paying attention to him, he teaches persuasion based on using politics as an example. So he's not really trying to pitch politics. He's not trying to pitch Trump. He's not trying to pitch the Republican Party over the Democrats. But it's such a painfully obvious and popular topic that you can just pick out the persuasion techniques being used, so he can use it as a backdrop and say, well, here's an issue. Here's maybe a smart way to think about it. Here's the critical thinking about it. Here's why Trump is being so persuasive. Here's why the Democrats are not being persuasive. And so it's a backdrop. It's a setting for teaching these techniques. So Scott Adams' main message in persuasion is that facts don't matter. That's where I'm heading today, is the main message. And we will compare that to Trey Gowdy, because I've been thinking about this all day. So his message is that facts don't matter. And the idea there is that we all have a confirmation bias. We have a frame of reference, a filter on the world. He describes it as two movies on one screen. And so you can look at Trump as an example. It doesn't matter what he does. It absolutely does not matter what Trump does. It doesn't matter what the issue is. There's a strong segment of the population, presumably all on the conservative side, or mostly on the populist side, let's put it that way, who see it as awesome. It doesn't matter what it is, it was awesome. They read into the facts, they read into the action, and they say, wow, this is great, this is so helpful for these reasons. And then there's an equally strong, or maybe at times stronger, set on the left who look at what Trump does and all they say is orange man bad, right? Doesn't matter what it is. There's a reason why it's bad, and they take what he means and they spin it and they take it out of context. Those are two filters, Trump awesome, Trump bad, that are applied to a set of facts. And so the idea is that facts don't matter. Your brain makes a decision first. It has a frame of reference, it has a bias, and then it looks for facts that support that confirmation bias. In fact, it changes facts that are existing. So if you find a fact that's contrary to your confirmation bias, you either ignore it or you spin that fact to be something different, and use it to support your confirmation bias. So I think I've used on this show before the idea of Scott wanting me, not Scott Adams, wanting to buy a Porsche, an overly expensive car for no reason. And how am I going to come up with that idea of buying a Porsche? Is it because I sat down and read a bunch of car magazines, did a bunch of stats and on performance and different safety criteria, and compared that to price and came up with a value metric? I did none of that. I would do none of that. This isn't a real issue. I don't need a Porsche anymore. But if I did, I would do none of that. I would decide in my mind, I need a Porsche. And then I would go out and find facts to support my decision. And I would completely ignore facts that told me that was a bad decision. And that's the way the human brain works. It's certainly the way mine works. And it's the way most other people's brains work as well. We are pattern recognition machines, meaning that we have a decision, we believe in patterns, and we look for facts to support those, and we ignore facts that do not support those. I'll give another example. In Trump world, in U.S. politics, you've got this idea of the Fine People hoax from Charlottesville. This is the entire premise of the Biden campaign. If you've been listening to a couple of days ago, the Democratic convention and Biden's speech, and now we've got the Republican convention going on every night. But the Biden speech, he told you straight up that it was the Charlottesville words from Trump that convinced him he needed to run his campaign. His entire presidential campaign is around this idea that there was protests and riots and confrontation in Charlottesville, and that Trump said that there was good people on both sides of the issue, and there's video to prove that he said that, which is deemed by the Democrats and by Biden to be a racist thing because there was white supremacists there, and so Trump is bad. He's a racist because of this Charlottesville issue, and that's why Joe Biden is running. Except that's not what the facts are. This never happened. Okay, what happened is, and you can go Google this, you don't have to take my word for it, I'm not trying to take a position on Trump or anybody else, but what happened is CNN cut that clip short on purpose, obviously, because he said there's good people on both sides of the issue, and then he specifically said, after CNN cut it off, the clip, he specifically said, by the way, I'm not talking about the white supremacists, I'm not talking about the racists, that's not what I'm talking about the statue issue. Okay, so he specifically said, without prompting, before the issue was even an issue, he specifically said that it wasn't the case, but that fact doesn't matter to the left. Okay, it doesn't matter. Joe Biden's entire campaign is premised on a hoax because of a purposely edited clip from CNN. Facts don't matter. Okay, you make up your mind and then you look for facts to support it. So that's what Scott Adams teaches. I've learned a ton from it, and it's very applicable to corporate change and to dealing with turnarounds. And then he teaches a bunch of techniques. I'm not gonna go through all of them here today, but one he teaches is, I'll give you a couple. One he teaches is pace and lead. And it's interesting. I had a conversation, someone called me out of the US this week to present me with an issue. They're developing or building out a new restaurant, and he's having management problems. He's the leader of this thing, and he's got a chef who, is I don't know if he's world famous, but he's right up there. He's a world world recognized chef for sure. And clearly, I don't know the fellow, but this comes with ego. It comes with a personality that has a lot of creativity associated with it. And then they've hired a high-end designer, because this is a very expensive restaurant. They've hired a high-end designer to design this place, and chef and the designer are fighting all the time. And the fellow who called me is caught in the middle. And what should he do about that? And the answer is pace and lead. What pace and lead means is if somebody says to you, if chef says to you, this designer's crazy, I don't know why we're paying her, things are going wrong, that wall shouldn't be there. That wasn't the real story, by the way. I'm just making things up. But if the chef has all these problems, and particularly if they're a creative personality, what you need to do to persuade that person is build trust. And the way you build trust is not to say to the person, hey, you're wrong. This designer is an expert, and that should go there. I agree with her, and you're being a baby. That's not how you build trust. The way you build trust is to agree with them, and in fact, take it even further, okay? So it's, oh, I know, chef, you're right. She's terrible. I don't agree with all her ideas, and the way she's treating you just isn't proper. And you really build up in that personality type. And in any negotiation, the person on the other side has to like you, and they have to trust you. And you can't do that by being combative. There has to be an element of pace and lead. And so, like, I hear you, and you don't have to sell your soul for that, by the way. It could just be empathy. Like, I hear you. I'm seeing the way that you're being treated, or I'm seeing the way that you feel like you're being treated, your lived reality, so to speak. And it's not good. And I'm sorry that you have to go through that. So let's work on what we're going to do about this together. And by the way, let's talk about that wall. Let's talk about that wall. And so you need to build that trust. That's what pace and leading is. Contrast is another element that he talks about. And it's funny, you're listening to the Republican convention this week, and you hear on TV every single expert talk about what the Republicans have to do because their convention was second, and 100% of the time they say contrast. What are our policies compared to Biden's policies? Why are we good and Biden bad? You can't just talk about half of that equation. You can't just say why is Biden bad, right? You can't just say why Trump's good if you're on the Republican side. I'm not trying to pitch that. But you have to draw contrast between the two of them. And I think that's where the Democrats fail, right? Like all they do is say why they think Trump is bad, and they've done nothing to say why they're good and what they would do about that, not as persuasive. And short repeated messages, just saying the same thing over and over again. Pace and lead, contrast, short repeated messages, persuasion is everything, like that, okay? And these are some persuasion tools that he teaches. And on this show, we're going to go in depth over time about more of these ideas. But it's a long explanation or a long lead into what I'm thinking about. So today has had me conflicted all day. So Trey Gowdy, I told you I listened to his podcast, and he has a new book out a couple of days ago. His new book is called Doesn't Hurt to Ask. I'm about a quarter of the way through it, half a way through it. No, Trey Gowdy, if you don't know, is a former congressman. Before that, he was a prosecutor. South Carolina, I believe. Maybe it was North Carolina, but I feel like it was South Carolina. Definitely in the Carolinas. And from the moment I've ever seen him on TV, I thought to myself, oh my God, how horrible would it be to be a defendant with this guy as a prosecutor? He is intimidating. He's smart. He's articulate. He's persuasive. He's forceful. And he's just like, you just want him on your team. You don't want to be in the opposite team. And I believe that his record, and I'm talking capital cases and serious cases, I believe his record as a prosecutor, I think he's batting 1,000. I don't think he's ever lost a jury case. I haven't done full research. You can fact check me on that, but I believe that to be true. Like this guy is incredibly persuasive. So he wrote a book, It Doesn't Hurt to Ask, Using the Power of Questions to Communicate, Connect, and Persuade. As a student of persuasion, I thought I'd pick up this book. And if you have the opportunity, it's a fantastic book. So, as I said, I'm partway through it. I don't have all the answers yet, But the essence of this is he learned young in life through a lack of confidence and through a lack of through a desire to want to hang out with people that were way above him, but he didn't have a lot to add to the conversation. He learned how to use questions to bridge that gap and to lead the counterparty to reach their own conclusions as opposed to making declarative statements, which, he would risk sounding stupid, but also he learned over time they're just not persuasive. It's not persuasive. So and to give you an example of that, let's go back to my Porsche story. So Scott wants a Porsche. What do you think would happen if you said to me, Scott, you don't need a Porsche? That's just stupid. You don't need a Porsche. That's a declarative statement. How would I react to that? I wouldn't be offended. Some people would be offended. I wouldn't be offended, but I wouldn't listen to it. There's no scenario where you would say to me, Scott, you don't need a Porsche, and I would go, damn, I didn't think about that. I honestly didn't think about that. You're right. You're right. I don't need a Porsche. Why didn't I think about that? That's not going to happen, right? Whereas if you ask a series of questions to try to persuade me that I don't need a Porsche, you might be a lot better off. A series of questions might be, hey, Scott, I know you told me that you like to buy a car to replace your old car, and what you use your vehicle for is to drive about 1/10 of a mile to drop off your daughter at school. And sometimes you drive to the airport through snowstorms, which is about 4 hours away to get to the airport from where you're living these days. And apart from that, you don't drive at all. Is that right? And if that's right, do you need is a $150,000 two-seater convertible the right way to go for that use of a vehicle? Also, how's that Porsche? I'm just wondering, because I know you live on a mountain and it snows about 12 months a year, and it's cold 10 months a year with a lot of accumulation. Is a two-seat sports car the way to go in that climate, or would you be better off with an SUV, right, or a pickup truck, or something along those lines? I know you can't. Can you get service on a Porsche in that little town that you live in, right? So these are the sorts of ways to ask questions that would cause me to be persuaded. Maybe I still buy the Porsche, but I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about your point of view way more than I was thinking about your point of view if you just said to me, Scott, you're an idiot. Don't buy a Porsche. You don't need that. And you're right. I am an idiot. I don't need the Porsche. I don't need it. But your declarative statement was not persuasive. The questions are a lot more persuasive. He also said that facts, Trey Gowdy has said that facts are paramount. Now, listen, this guy was a trial lawyer. He was a prosecutor, and his job was to persuade juries. And he talks about years of pre-preparation, interviewing witnesses in advance, going through the forensics and getting every fact down. And that facts are paramount in persuasion, which was my problem most of the day as I was going through my work. I'm trying to reconcile the Scott Adams facts don't matter with the Trey Gowdy facts are paramount. Interesting problem. Maybe not for you, but for me, it's an interesting problem. And how do I apply that to business and the thinking? And here's what I've come up with so far. My conclusion is this, and I got to finish Trey's book, so I may change this. I'll share it with you if I do change it, but here's what I think. Facts don't matter when I'm trying to form my frame of reference, okay? When I decide I want a Porsche, the facts had no bearing on that whatsoever. I decided I want a Porsche through my perception of their brand, through my perception of, the holes that I might have in my life that I'm trying to fill with a vehicle. And so it's not facts, it's emotion, it's feeling that caused me to create that bias, that confirmation bias. I don't hate Trump based on facts. I hate Trump because I've been persuaded of hating Trump from the media or through my own issues in my life that make that sort of personality the devil to me. And so it wasn't facts that drove me into that position. I don't think that I've concluded that facts don't matter in maintaining my confirmation bias, my filter on the world, my one movie on a two movie screen, right? So I formed it initially, and then I see a bunch of facts, and they don't change my mind because I pick facts that support my view. I change facts or ignore facts that don't support my view. But if I'm trying to persuade you to move a little bit, I have to have my facts down. Facts become paramount because you may ignore the facts that I'm trying to use to move you in your point of view, in your frame of reference, and your confirmation bias. But if I don't have facts, I don't stand a chance. And so I think there's a way to bridge the advice of these two professionals in persuasion. And again, I come back to my Porsche issue for this: how to persuade me, by asking questions and pointing out facts such as what I use my vehicle for. I just drive to school, right? That's literally down the hill. I drive to the airport. I live in a mountain that's a snowy climate. Those are facts, but they're presented to me in questions which serve a way to sort of drag me from my current bias to maybe question myself, which has got to be the goal of persuasion. So I think that's interesting. And so I was playing around last night on my Twitter account, trying to think like, it turns out that when I work in troubled businesses, I've been using this approach of asking questions all the time, like, how do you approach this? How do you approach that? And instead of telling them that's dumb, it's wrong, it doesn't even need to be judgmental. It's just that it's wrong. That's not going to work. Instead of me saying that, I ask questions. I say like, well, what's your experience with that? How has it worked for you? You know, if you've done this and you had a problem and then you tried that, what does that tell you? Does it tell you you should keep doing it again, or does it tell you we should be looking for a different approach, right? And what is the cost of doing the wrong thing when maybe I recognize there's a cost of not doing this thing, which is why you're doing that thing. You're not doing A because it scares you and there's risk, so you choose to do B, but we've proven B is wrong, right? How is that a smart decision? You know, have you done that analysis? So it turns out that I do that all the time, but through reading Trey Gowdy's book or part of it, I'm recognizing the technique and how powerful it is. And so I was playing around last night on my Twitter with the idea of the one thing in politics that's just driving me in U.S. politics is driving me insane right now, which is the Democratic contention that the Republicans ignore science, right? So the Democrats say, well, we believe in science, and those people in the middle, on the right, they don't believe in science at all. And again, this is not a politics show. I'm trying to prove a point in a technique and in the way to persuade that's really, really important in your business, in changing culture, changing the way people behave, changing the way you think about yourself and your business. And what drives me nuts in politics right now is this whole science thing. And if you listen to the Democratic convention, you had Biden, who straight up said, you know, if the scientists advise him that he would lock down the economy, if he was elected, as the scientists said, hey, there's a COVID risk, lock it down, just lock it down. Don't let any businesses open, people can't leave their house. He would lock down the economy because he would listen to scientists, listen to the scientists. And the implication there, of course, is that Trump, his competition, would not listen to the scientists. He would maybe not lock who the hell knows what he would do? He's a crazy man, right? But VP Joe Biden, heading to be president, if I'm president, I will listen to the scientists. So I thought to myself, that really bugs me. And how would I persuade somebody that this makes no sense? And if I did it in my normal way of declarative statements, what I found is that my thinking wouldn't even be clear. I wouldn't be able to express myself as to why I just find that so distasteful and so stupid. But I do find it distasteful and stupid. But if I take Trey Gowdy's approach and I start putting this in questions, not only do I find it persuasive, but oh my God, did it clarify my thinking for me. And it was so easy. It's so easy to write down a bunch of questions related to this whole thing about I would shut down the economy if the scientists told me to. I would lock you in your house if the scientists told me to. And so I'm going to walk you through to try and prove my point. And if you disagree with me, again, don't make this about politics. Don't make it about science. I don't care. I'm not trying to pitch one side or the other. I don't care what you think. This is an all-inclusive show, and it's about business and it's about life, and it's the way we think about things. But let's just say I'm asking questions to you, and you believe in this whole Joe Biden, we're going to lock it down because the scientists told us to. Or let's say I'm talking to Joe Biden directly. What sort of questions would I ask him? And I would start with, Mr. Vice President, why do you expect, or do you expect at all, do you expect that the scientists in the U.S. or in the world would be unanimous in shutting down the economy? Why do you think scientists would be unanimous in their opinion, in their advice to you as president, that you should lock down the economy? When is the last time in all of human history, when is the last time, maybe one time in human history, that all scientists were unanimous and there was a consensus on one issue? Unanimous consensus on one issue. Let me give you a hint on that, by the way, Mr. President or Mr. Vice President. Gravity is not the answer, right? If I fall out of a tree, I'm going to hit the ground. But if you Google dissenting views on gravity, turns out gravity is a scientific theory. There's lots of dissenting views on that. Scientists are not unanimous on the gravity in the way that we think about it. I had a lecture on that from a scientist a couple of years ago, and he was right, much to my surprise. If there is no consensus, I don't think there's a consensus, and you've answered the questions that you think there might be or you think there might be, but what are the odds that if you had a political will to shut down the economy and to lock people in their homes, what are the odds that you as president of the U.S. government could find a scientist to support your view? Is that 100%? Is it 98%? What are the chances that there will be someone in the scientific community on which you can rely who supports the decision that you want to make politically? I think we need to answer that question. And who are these scientists anyways on which you intend to rely? Are you going to tell us up front who they are, or are you going to decide after you hear their varied opinions? Do we get to vote on these scientists, on the ones that you want to follow? Because if you're just going to defer to their opinion, I think it fair in a democracy. Or do you think it fair in a democracy that the population gets to vote on which scientists you want to follow? And what sort of scientists are we talking about anyways? What discipline of science will you be relying on when you're trying to rely on scientists? And when you talk about scientists, do you really mean medical doctors, not scientists? Is that just a definitional issue? And if it is doctors, what kind of doctors? Is it virologists, or what other sort of doctors? How about mental health practitioners? We know that there's been all sorts of mental health problems. There's been depression and anxiety associated with lockdowns. Will you be listening to them as well as the scientists, and as well as the medical doctors, as well as the virologists? What about early learning specialists? What about the children who can't go to school and who are trying to learn off a computer instead of learn like little children do, which is through association and play with their peers? So will you be listening to early learning specialists as well? What about economists? Will you be talking? Do you include that in the definition of scientists? And do you think that all of these different disciplines and practitioners will have a consensus as to whether to shut down the economy or not? And let me ask you another question on this. If you, Mr. Vice President, were a scientist, if you were a scientist, how would you evaluate the risk and reward of telling a government to not shut down? What is the risk of telling the government to not shut down? And what is the reward of telling the government to not shut down? What is the profit? Where is the profit in a professional saying to not lock down the economy? Is there any chance at all that any professional on the face of the earth would ever recommend not shutting down? Is it not 100% that every single professional, purely from a risk-reward perspective, 100% of professionals would say you should lock things down, correct? I mean, wouldn't they say that? I would think so. My experience with professionals. Lastly, Mr. Vice President, if you were president, and in your role as president, you were deferring to the scientists to lock down the economy, why do we need a president? Aren't you just an intermediary in that capacity? Why don't we just go directly to the scientists and skip the whole president thing if you're just going to defer to the experts? So that was my list of questions. Honestly, it took me 5 minutes to come up with that. I could never have expressed that opinion declaratively as affirmative statements. These ideas would not have occurred to me. As I wrote them down, as I read them, I sure as hell persuaded myself before it was a feeling. But I'd be curious from you. Did you find that series of questions persuasive? Or more persuasive than me saying, hey, this whole relying on scientists things is just stupid because they're never going to agree. And so you're just passing the buck. I don't know. I find it interesting. I like the questioning approach. And I think that in retrospect, I do that in business, but not as formally. It's been really useful for me. I think if you're having troubles in your business and you want to persuade people to change, whether they be internal, whether they be stakeholders, whether you're in a negotiation for whatever reason, I think asking questions is a great way to get somebody to move out of their confirmation bias in your direction. All right, let's talk about Mary. Now, this is several episodes old, this story. It's about persuasion as well. And if you haven't been listening, I'm going to do a recap of this because we started maybe 5-6 episodes ago on Martinis with Scott. And because it was in negotiation, this particular issue, I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to jinx it. So Mary is a fictional name. But the story is 100% real. Is an example to me of entrepreneurs and the risks that they take and the problems that they run into. One of the reasons that I started Martinis with Scott was to help on issues with this, which is why I got the phone call to begin with, I believe. And I agreed to help out this young lady. And she's a tremendous person. And so let me just give you the backdrop on the story. So this girl who I've called Mary, somewhere in North America, started a business as an entrepreneur and started it. It's a retail location and started a specialty retail location. It started with a business partner, another lady who's older than her and who, I've never met this other partner, by the way, who's older than her, had more experience in the particular industry that they were focused on. And Mary felt the need to bring into a partner because she was younger and newer to the industry. And at the end of the day, it just becomes a confidence thing, which is what happens with a lot of partnership. And so Mary invested into this business roughly $80,000 of her own money that she skimped and scraped together. Her partner put in $80,000. So now we're at $160,000. And they owned the shares 50-50. But what Mary also did is she personally went out and borrowed from a friend another $80,000 and put that into the business. So now Mary's put in $160,000, of which she borrowed personally $80,000 from somebody. And her partner, who's 50-50, put in $80,000, not $160,000. As I said, the shareholding was 50-50. Mary is president, the partner was vice president, both of them were a director. Another stakeholder of the business is a landlord because they have a lease in a mall which they're not paying because of the COVID issue. And when I started talking to Mary maybe 2 months ago on this, there's no money in the account, or was very little money in the account. She said they were breaking even, but they weren't breaking even because they weren't paying their rent during COVID and they weren't paying any salaries. So all they were doing really was turning dollars, if you understand what that means. So they're losing money, barely paying their rent pre-COVID, not paying their rent during COVID, and at no time have they ever paid a salary of any significance to either of the working partners, which, by the way, is true of most small businesses. 90% of businesses never ever pay their founder a living wage. And so it's just it's terrible stats. It's the risk that you take as an entrepreneur, and Mary has experienced that. When I met her and started talking about this issue, when she phoned me up on it, there was a massive fight between the partners. Really contempt, I think, is the right way to put it. that any hope of reviving this partnership was pretty much dead. And the real question that she put to me was, in that scenario, how do you buy somebody out? Okay, how do I buy this person out? And again, they're not making money. There's no money in the account. I think maybe one thing that I forgot to tell you is on the books, there was about $50,000 of inventory, which at liquidation value, who knows, call it $10,000, call it $20,000 at most. And those are the only assets of the business. So she says to me, well, how do I buy somebody out? What's the formula for that? What's the typical way to go about this? Which I said, there is no typical way to go about this. This company is worth nothing and it's insolvent. And so here's what I want you to think about. I don't want you to think about how do I buy this person out. I want you to think about the different hats that you have in this business, because there's three parties to this business. There's you, there's your partner, and there's the corporation. And the corporation is its own entity. And what you're talking about is buying your partner, but buying your partner out of what? Buying their shares. The shares are worth zero, and you have different hats anyways. So what are your different hats? You've got a director hat, you've got a officer hat, being the president, you've got a shareholder hat as a shareholder of this business, you have an employee hat who works there on a daily basis and doesn't get paid, or turns out they rotated shifts, so it wasn't daily basis, but often, and you don't get paid. And you have a creditor hat, which means what? It means that you loan money to the business. And every one of those positions, every one of those hats, as I put it, has different rights and responsibility vis-a-vis the other partner and vis-a-vis the corporation, the company. And so what you need to do is understand your different hats. And if you say to me, how do I buy this person out? What you're really saying is, I'm prioritizing my shareholder hat, and I only own half the shares, and I want to get 100% of the shares and get rid of this person. That's what you're saying, right? As opposed to prioritizing your creditor hat, because the fact of the matter is, you loaned $160,000 to this business. Now she got back 20 of the 160, so now she was owed 140. You've loaned $140,000 to this business, and this business, not the partner, but the corporation as a separate entity, this corporation owes you that money. It owes you that $140,000. And how are you getting that back exactly, right? You're talking about paying money for worthless shares, and you're ignoring the fact that you've already sunk $140,000 into this, and how are you going to get that back, okay? And so that was a bit of an eye-opening conversation for Mary. And then we set out some objectives, because, if you're going to win a negotiation with this, if you're going to try to persuade another party, there's a bunch of things you need to do. But before you do any of that, what you need to do is be really clear internally on what your objectives are and what makes you happy. So we talked about that for 2 or 3 phone calls. I asked her to go away. I asked her a bunch of questions. I asked her to go think about it. And at the end of the day, what she said is, I recognize that if I were to liquidate the company today, just close it, change the locks, shut it down, that I would get probably zero. Because you could sell the inventory, as I said, for liquidation value of $10,000, $20,000, but you haven't paid the rent to your landlord. You've got to pay somebody to liquidate. There's going to be fees associated with that. So maybe you walk out with a little bit of money, but effectively it's zero. So and everything else is a sunk cost. So what do you deserve today? Well, from a value perspective, you deserve zero, right? From a sunk cost perspective, you've got net $140,000 in there, plus a bunch of time, plus your hopes and dreams, all tied up in this organization. At the end of the day, she said, 100%, I have to be able to pay the person back that I borrowed this $80,000, now $60,000 from. And because she had collected the 20 back and gave it to that person, she says, otherwise I'm just going to be working, I'm going to be working the next 10 years in my day job, trying to pay off this debt to this person, which I just have to pay it back. That's the right thing to do. I can walk away from my other investment in this failed business, but I absolutely need to do that. That was the internal goal that her and I agreed on. Now, how do you get $60,000 out of somebody, out of a situation? I don't want to say out of somebody, but out of a situation that I described. So you've got a partner that won't talk to you, that's trying to intimidate you, that is bullying you. Whether that's true or not, by the way, doesn't matter. As we've talked about at length on this show, it's her lived experience. It's how she feels about it. She feels like she was being bullied and intimidated and disrespected, and the value of all of this stuff is nothing. So what I said to her, Mary, is like, you need to win. This is not about buying out. This is not about being bought out. This is a collection action. Okay, how much of your $140,000 can you get back, recognizing that your $140,000 is worth zero today, okay, or very, very little. Which is not to say the other person wouldn't give you some money for that, all right, because they have a motivation to step into the business, but purely on a value basis, it's not worth anything today. So we agreed that a home run would be she could pay the $60,000 back to the person that she borrowed it from. So how do we go about this negotiation when the other side is hostile, maybe not entirely stable, from what I've heard, unsophisticated, and bullying, and quite clear? I've disclosed on other shows, it came out through some emails that were accidentally, our side was copied on it, that they were working to not pay. Like it was a flat out in writing admission that they were taking positions in an effort to not give Mary anything ever. That was her goal. All right. So how do you deal with that situation? I mean, it's a difficult situation. Well, the first thing you do is you have to, now we're into persuasion techniques. The first thing, and this applies to troubled businesses, to always negotiations, you have to do this. You have to do it every day that you're in this business. You have to get their attention, because if people aren't listening to you, you can't persuade. So you have to trigger something. Okay. So what did we do to trigger something? We talked about this on a prior show. Is I wrote up a demand letter. I did it from Sinclair Range. I wrote up a demand letter, and I wrote it to the corporation with a copy to the partner. And I said, hey, corporation, we act on behalf of Mary. We're not lawyers, but we are agents in this capacity. We act on behalf of Mary, and you owe us $140,000, and you have 10 days to pay us in full, or we're taking further action. Okay, put it in writing, put it on letterhead. And the idea there was, well, it is a debt. So we can demand on the debt. You loan the money in, and you have a right to call it back. And so you have to give some sort of time period. We chose 10 days. So that's all legit. And I'm confident that we could have pushed that forward in court should we want to. But I didn't expect that anybody was going to write us a check for $140,000, because there's no money there. There's no value there. There's no money there. And how much could the partner afford to put into this business anyways? Mary's partner to pay out this debt to Mary, which Mary's partner doesn't even think it was a debt. She thinks it was a quote unquote investment. That was part of their strategies. Don't call it a debt, call it an investment. Here's a little pro tip on this. An investment doesn't make any sense. Okay, you give money to a company, you either bought something, and that something could be a debenture, which is a debt, could be a promissory note, which is a debt. It could be a share instrument, which is a pref or a common, but it's a share instrument. But you either bought something, and if you didn't buy something, then it's just an advance, which is the same thing as a loan. It's an undocumented loan, but it's still a loan. And if you loan money to somebody, you have a right to get it back. Okay, so we demanded, and we triggered a response. And the triggered response was not a productive response. It was a lot of screaming and yelling, which you're going to get at first. And what you try to do is not accept their framing. You need to set up your frame of the discussion. In this case, my framing was, you're a bad person, we're a good person, we loaned, and I'm using their language, we loaned $140,000, you have to pay it back, and the clock is ticking, or else. Okay, and so that carried on for a few days back and forth. And then they hired a lawyer, which is always a good thing. You think, oh no, they hired a lawyer, but that's not the case, because now you've got somebody more sophisticated that you can negotiate with. And if you're not a lawyer, or if you're not sophisticated, if you're not a financial person and you're in this situation, you need to hire a professional advisor so you can go through this discussion. There's real value in that. But I do this for a living, and I deal with these trouble situations for a living. So I was happy. They hired a lawyer. The lawyer started pushing on a settlement, and it was really low numbers. It was, well, we'll give you 10,000. Then we said no, and we pushed back and forth, and it went up to 20,000. And every time we replied to something and negotiated and got all the issues on the table, it would take them 3-4 days a week. They're just slow walking this thing to get back to us. And every communication from this lawyer was trying to reframe this, that we were the bad people, and that this wasn't debt anyways, and we don't know what the hell they're talking about. They started attacking me because I'm not a lawyer. That's every lawyer's move, is to try to do that. And we just kept pushing, but it came a time when I was feeling for about 2 weeks that we needed to re-trigger this. We needed to re-get their attention because this is just dragging on. But what was I going to do? My options were, we could have fired the person because Mary is president and the partner was vice president. So we could have fired her. We could have sued her. I considered having me appointed as chief restructuring officer over the corporation, which Mary could do in her capacity as president. And what's funny about that idea is that, the directors were 50-50. There were 2 directors, Mary and the partner. And so to stop that, there would have to be a director's resolution, which could never pass because Mary could block it. And at a shareholder level, they were also 50-50. So there was no way to stop Mary from firing the partner or from appointing me as a CRO. But I was looking for some way to trigger in this negotiation. And then the opportunity presented itself. And I expressed this in the positive as an opportunity. But what happened was a terrible thing, which is that, both parties had some access to the corporate bank account, and the partner scooped some cash, which in retrospect she claims to be for a business expense, but seemed pretty clear up front to be not for a business expense, and not a bunch of cash, maybe a few $1,000s. And at that point, there was about $45,000 in the account. So bang, that day, we took that money. Okay, so Mary had the right to pay herself, perhaps even the obligation to pay herself. She's the president of a corporation that from its primary creditor, had a demand served against her. She ought to be using corporate. Why would somebody else be prioritized over that demand if you put your different hats on? That doesn't make any sense. But what we did was we took that money, and I wrote a nice letter to the lawyer, and I said, look, your client ripped off funds. They stole money. So we took the rest of the money out to preserve corporate assets, and that money is available to the business. Should we need it, just send me a request. We'll look at it, and if we agree with that business expense, we'll make that payment with those funds, and we will not spend the money. Mary will not spend that money at all, okay? And that is 100% true. It's not spinning. You have to be accurate in these things. You have to have good faith, and you have to be, always taking the high road, because it's the right thing to do. But also, if you end up in court later, you just can't be seen playing silly bugger and games on this stuff. But you got one partner ripping off corporate assets. It seems more than fair to protect those corporate assets, yet to make them available and not to use them for your personal benefit, which is the position we took. It had the side benefit of re-triggering this situation, of creating another sense of urgency, and that it did. They kind of went off the deep end. They accused her of all sorts of terrible things, but at the end of the day, we got our settlement. And we settled and closed today. And the settlement was effectively for $65,000. So $5,000 more than the home run internal ballpark of 60. I feel like this is a massive win. I feel like we created it really through persuasion and through negotiation. And so I thought you would enjoy that story. I've told you some of this before, but some things to remember from this as an entrepreneur. Mary and her partner did not have a shareholders agreement, and you need one. Partnerships don't last. Look at 90% of businesses ultimately fail. They never pay anybody a proper wage. 90% of businesses. So it's easy to say that partnerships fail, and that's 100% true. But maybe they fail because businesses fail, and 2 people or 3 people in a partnership can't hang out in a business and work and be unpaid forever. And so that manifests itself in partnership stresses. But partnerships fail, and you need a document that dictates what happens and what the process is for breaking up, if in fact you're going to break up. If you're going to lend money to your own business, put your creditor hat on and treat it as a lender. Document the loan, get security over the assets of the business, have it written up properly, charge interest, have a payment schedule, have a term, okay? Even if you think of it as an investment, have a term on that, and have default, okay? And defaults would be, hey, if our partnership turns into a fight and we're not making money, I want to get my money back, and I want to get my money back ahead of the shareholders. Wear your different hats, understand what shareholder value is. Remember, the initial question to me from Mary is, how do I buy my partner out? How do I pay money to her for something that's worthless, was the initial question. Understand what shareholder value is, which is the amount of money that you can put in your pocket, discounted for in the future, discounted for time and risk. Don't tie up your dreams into a failed venture. Her dream to be in this industry and to be an entrepreneur is not the same as having this company and being a 50% shareholder. That was a step along the way of achieving this dream. It's a failed step, but that doesn't impact the dream, right? I mean, you need to be able to separate those things as an entrepreneur, or you're not going to be able to make proper decisions. And most importantly, as related to today's topic on Martinis with Scott, if you want a solution, if you want to be able to negotiate and to win, and to gain that winning momentum to affect change, you need to get their attention, okay? Because that's the first rule of persuasion. If no one's paying attention to you, if your counterparty is not taking you seriously, you're just never going to do a deal, okay? And so there's an example for me. I know it's small numbers, but for entrepreneurs, this is real. This was so stressful for poor Mary, and I think we've come to a good solution. I'm super happy for her. I know a bunch of you were listening to this, to the couple of Mary episodes that we've done, and you wanted to know what the result was. Well, now you know the answer. I'm happy, and she's happy. Thank you for listening. That's my time for today. I think I had more, but we're an hour into this already, so I will let you go. This has been Martinis with Scott, a show about winning momentum in life and in business. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Please surf the channels, subscribe. We'll talk to you next week.